Wonderful. Well, good afternoon, good morning, everybody. Welcome to this online event of the Illiberalism Studies program at the George Washington University. I'm delighted to have you with us today and to have our two colleagues from Loughborough University presenting their latest book, The Illiberal Public Sphere, Media in Polarized Societies. It's an impressive research that has been done around the book, and the book is in open access, so please feel free to download it. It's the first kind of comprehensive studies of the role of media in the rise of illiberalism. And it's really showing how much a scholar coming from the field of communication studies can bring to the discussion on illiberalism, which for very long was kind of concentrated around political science. It's really helping us kind of looking at, challenging the kind of mainstream vision we have of the role of social media in kind of fostering illiberalism, and is giving us and bringing so many kind of insight and kind of granular, nuanced knowledge on how we should think about the role of media in our polarized society. So we have the two authors with us. First, Václav Štětka, who is reader in comparative political communication, and Sabina Mihelj, who is professor of media and culture analysis, both coming from Loughborough University. They have been working together on several projects looking at the role of media, the articulation between media, populism, democracy, and culture, especially looking at cases coming from Central Europe. So we are delighted to have you both here, Sabina and Václav. We give you now the floor for about 30 minutes, and then we will have time for the Q&A. So Sabina, I give you the floor first.
Thank you very much, Marlene, and thank you also to you and John for hosting this event. As you know, I and Václav have been following the work of George Washington University and your Illiberalism Studies program for a while now, and we always felt that our book has a particularly interesting audience among your networks. So we're very pleased to have the opportunity to present our ideas today. Václav, if you can turn to the next slide. So as Marlene already mentioned, the book is available open access, so we've included the QR code here as well. So we were lucky enough to obtain funding from the UK Funder for Economic and Social Sciences to be able to cover the costs of open access, which will hopefully help with spreading our work and making it more accessible. Now, every book project, as you might imagine, has a story, so to speak. Our story, or the story of this book, goes back at least as far as 2016 for obvious reasons. This was a moment when me and Václav realized that the kinds of phenomena and trends that we were noticing in media and communication in Eastern Europe were clearly part of a global phenomenon, and we felt that we are strongly positioned to be able to contribute to the evolving discussion on this and situate this regionally specific trends into a wider global picture. So this was what motivated us actually to turn to this project. You may wonder why we chose not to focus our work on other possible terms that were in circulation at the time, concepts such as populism, for instance. We quickly realized that populism in particular was too narrow for us to capture what we saw happening around us. And we felt that illiberalism was a more capacious term that allowed us to capture this gray zone between democracy and authoritarianism. Obviously, illiberalism studies as a field was already forming at that time, but the communication element was missing. So we envisaged our project and the book as a contribution that helps conceptualize the communicative aspects of the rise of illiberalism. We were lucky enough to obtain substantial funding from the UK Economics and Social Research Council that allowed us to conduct systematic multi-method research in 4 countries of Eastern Europe. We selected Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, and Serbia because we felt they represented at that point in time different levels of polarization, but also different experiences with democratization and democratic deconsolidation. And we used mixed methods, a combination of population surveys, expert surveys, interviews, as well as media diaries. I'm not going to say much more about the project itself, but there is a web page there that we would welcome you to consult if you're interested. The first thing we needed to do was some conceptual ground clearing for the book, and that involved defining illiberalism itself. Obviously, there was some important work done in this direction already, but we felt we had some distinct elements to add. And we identified three constitutive elements or features of illiberalism. The first one is what we call the paradox of illiberalism, in the sense that illiberalism is both dependent on liberal democracy, but also fundamentally opposed to it. So it relies on liberal democratic institutions as well as values, in particular freedom of speech, for instance, to acquire popularity, to reach citizens, and ultimately to spread. And this was also a point that comes very much through Marlene's work on illiberalism, and we agree is absolutely key. The second fundamental element of illiberalism is its dual nature. What we mean by that is that it's not sufficient to see liberalism only as an ideology, but it's important to also recognize that it also encompasses a set of practices and institutional arrangements. While this may seem self-evident, what we notice certainly in media and communication literature, but also more generally, is that these two things tend to be analyzed separately. So there's work that focuses on the ideological aspects or cultural aspects, and work that focuses on institutional aspects. And we felt it's important to recognize both of those together. And finally, the third and perhaps the most innovative element of our conceptual framework is the emphasis on illiberalism as a dynamic or disruptive force. Here we emphasize the fact that illiberalism is never static. It always seeks to change something, to challenge status quo, and leads ultimately to a gradual decoupling of democracy for constitutional liberalism that can ultimately also open doors to authoritarianism. Next slide, please. At this point, let me just briefly shed light on how exactly we see the difference between illiberalism and populism. So first of all, both illiberalism and populism are paradoxical. They both rely on this paradoxical relationship with democracy. However, quickly after that, the similarities end. Populism refers to phenomena that are ideologically as well as normatively, if you wish, considerably more diverse than what we normally associate with illiberalism. And this is why populism is also quite often conceptualized as a thin ideology, as an empty container, and so on. And particularly important to understand here is that populism encompasses also elements that are not necessarily a threat to democracy. Quite often populism and populist arguments can function as a kind of corrective to democracy. They can help open doors for marginalized communities. They can help open debates on taboo topics, for instance. And because of that, we feel that conflating populism and illiberalism can actually potentially at least end up euphemizing racism and even contribute to mainstreaming the far right. So it was very important for us on a number of levels to distinguish between the two and focus really on illiberalism. So the conceptual solution that we adopt in the book is to treat populism as a specific political strategy, a discourse, or as a style, as it's often conceptualized also in our field, that is centered on this characteristic opposition of people and the elite, which can be adopted then by a range of actors from different ideological backgrounds. And this can also be obviously illiberal actors. Our conceptualization of the liberal public sphere is very much grounded in the definition of illiberalism as I just outlined. So at the basic level, we define it as a communicative space that comprises both traditional and new media that promote and amplify illiberal actors and attitudes. And then in line with the paradoxical and disruptive nature of illiberalism, the liberal public sphere is likewise both dependent on its liberal competitors, so on the liberal public sphere, but it also seeks to undermine it and to displace it. So what we see happening then is that the illiberal public sphere effectively colonizes the institutions that have previously served as cornerstones of the liberal public sphere. For instance, it colonizes public service media that are obviously most closely aligned, typically with state institutions. Now, why the public sphere? The public sphere as a concept offers a number of advantages. First of all, and as Marlene mentioned already in the introduction, it allows us to broaden the view beyond digital media. We felt that in existing debates, and that's still true today, the discussion is very much focused on digital media as the sole source and the sole location and driver of illiberalism, which is really not helpful. Particularly, it's not helpful when we reach the more advanced stages of the illiberal public sphere, as we see also in a number of countries these days. So it is important to also include other forms of media beyond the digital. Secondly, the public sphere pushes us to recognize both the systemic institutional aspects of media and communication in the public sphere, as well as the cultural elements, so the narratives, the discourses, the symbols that circulate within particular media institutions. And finally, the public sphere also is convenient because it pushes us to recognize that the normative assumptions that guide public communication are not necessarily grounded in liberal democracy. There are a number of other models and a number of other normative assumptions. And in our theoretical part of the book, we actually engage also with existing conceptualizations and empirical work that has sought to move beyond the Habermasian liberal bourgeois model. I'm not going to go into details on that at all, but we've just briefly listed some of the key references there to give you a sense of where our work sits. And in the book, we explain more clearly how we see our concept advancing or differing from these other types of non-Habermasian public spheres. And finally, briefly about the other key element of our conceptualization, and that is the model of 3 stages of the illiberal public sphere. So we distinguish between the incipient stage, ascendant stage, and hegemonic stage. At the incipient stage, the illiberal public sphere is still fragmented. It exists mostly on the fringes of the political and media systems. It's typically driven by minor oppositional parties, fringe movements, cultural organizations also, and NGOs. And at this stage, media policies and regulations still tend to guarantee a level of independence from government. When it comes to the ascendant stage, the liberal public sphere already colonizes some mainstream channels. Typically, public service media are those that come under attack first. And then at this stage also liberal actors are already in positions of power, so they have been elected to key positions of power and have started changing the regulatory environment that, among other things, enables them to expand their control over the media and also allows them to promote the liberal narratives and symbols and values within the public sphere. And finally, reaching the hegemonic stage, the liberal public sphere dominates. The liberal public sphere is in retreat. It's pushed mostly online. And the liberal actors now are really firmly entrenched in positions of power, that they may be in power for the 2nd term at this stage, at least. Most media and cultural institutions are colonized, and illiberal narratives also prevail in the public domain. Now, let me immediately add that this typology is not meant to be set in stone. It's meant as a collection of ideal types, so that every single country can be moved somewhere on can be placed somewhere on a continuum between the 3 stages. So, for instance, the Czech Republic, when we conducted our research, was at the cusp of the incipient and ascendant stage. Poland was very firmly in the ascendant stage, and Hungary and Serbia in the hegemonic stage. And I'll hand over to Václav at this point.
Thank you, Sabina. So following from the theoretical foundations and the outline of our model of the illiberal public sphere, I'm going to turn to the presentation of some underpinning data, which were collected as part of the Illiberal Turn project, mentioned by Sabina at the beginning of the talk. And I will do this in order to empirically illustrate some of the key constitutive processes which we believe facilitate the rise of the illiberal public sphere and its progression through the 3 stages, and simultaneously mark the decline of its liberal counterpart. In particular, these constitutive processes include polarization of the media landscape and audience attitudes, mainstreaming and normalization of illiberal attitudes, which often occurs following the capture of mainstream media outlets by illiberal actors, although many of them might simply choose to platform illiberal opinions as part of the business strategy. Furthermore, we observe changing nature of media trust, which in the advanced stages of the illiberal public sphere is principally driven by partisanship, and it's becoming separated from the normative criteria on journalistic professionalism, especially with regards to independence. And finally, last but not least, certainly, we see the shifting role of digital media, whose relative importance, I emphasize it's a relative importance, in facilitating illiberalism sort of declines progressively as the illiberal public sphere grows. And simultaneously, they are becoming the main instrument of the liberal resistance. There's not enough time in this presentation to go through all of these processes in detail, so I'll be selective and focus on just 2 of them as sort of an illustration of our approach. And I will start with polarization, which we have detected, as I said, both on the level of media landscapes and audience political attitudes. And we argue in the book that these processes actually go hand in hand. When it comes to the media systems or landscapes polarization, this chart presents outcomes from an expert survey, which maps the position of selected media outlets in the 4 countries on the ideological and political axis at the time of the data collection. I need to emphasize, because that was the data were collected in 2020. So whatever you see on the map is relevant for that particular time point. Just to explain, the horizontal axis is the or maps the outlets on the liberal conservative spectrum, and the vertical shows the pro-government versus anti-government editorial bias. And I think the visual message of this chart is really more important than the placement of the actual individual outlets. The fact that only 2 of the 4 quadrants are filled with news outlets is indicative of the fact that the majority of the vast majority of the news outlets are either in the pro-government conservative camp or liberal anti-government bloc. And furthermore, if we zoomed in on the center of the map, which is already rather scarcely populated compared to the upper right and lower bottom quadrant, we see pretty much the only outlets are from the Czech Republic and Poland. In other words, in Hungary and Serbia, this political ideological center of their respective media systems are pretty much void, emptied, which indicates, in our opinion, greater depth of polarization in these 2 countries than in the Czech Republic and Poland. But when examining polarization, we have not relied just on the expert assessment of the news media outlets, but we have also explored audience consumption habits. However, as we know, people usually consume more than just one news medium, and therefore to assess the extent of people's overall media diets, we have utilized the so-called media repertoires approach. And we have, through that, identified 5 distinct clusters or media repertoires, as we call them, which are distinguished by the extent of their political and ideological homogeneity versus heterogeneity. And one of the main findings from this analysis is that actually in most countries, the majority of people belong to so-called open repertoires. Those people are predominantly consuming news from either liberal anti-government sources, that's the blue-colored group, or from conservative pro-government sources, that's the pink-colored group. But in either case, there are also always some news from the opposite camp, right? That's why we call them open, at least occasionally. So these people are in principle not closing themselves off to news that are not matching their political and ideological preferences, unlike people in the 2 closed repertoire groups, which are marked gray and orange on this graph, and which are almost exclusively consuming news from just one of those groups. So as you can see, the size of these closed groups is particularly large in Serbia, where actually over 43% of the audiences consume news very much only from pro-government conservative sources. But the other main finding from this analysis is the absence of the so-called balanced repertoire. So that's the green one. So very much from all the countries, it's only present in the Czech Republic, where it accounts for over 30% of the audiences. And that's the repertoire that features either neutral media or relatively proportionate representation of news sources from both sides of the spectrum. And again, the fact that, as I said, about a third of the Czech news audiences are characterized by this balanced diet is primarily linked to the impartiality and a strong market position of the Czech public service broadcaster. That's the main news brand within that repertoire. So the outcome from this is that polarization of the news media landscape is to a large extent complemented by polarization of audiences. The match is not a 100% one, but it is sufficient to sort of underpin our argument that one of the key tipping points in the expansion of the illiberal public sphere from the incipient to ascendant stage is really the hollowing out of the center in the news media system, both with regards to news production, that's the media landscape, and consumption. And in consequence, we believe it is plausible to argue that as the illiberal public sphere progresses, expands, the proportion of audiences who are exposed to ideologically and politically homogeneous sources grows. And that further sort of adds to the spiral of polarization, as we call it, because citizens are left very much with no other choice but to resort to ideologically and politically biased outlets. And that further sort of exacerbates the polarizing tendencies. However, it has to be also noted that as the illiberal public sphere expands, the polarization not only grows, but it also becomes more asymmetrical, in that sense that one side grows grows considerably bigger in scope and colonizes a larger proportion of the media system. And the case in this point is, again, the state of news media market in Hungary and in Serbia, which are heavily tilted towards the right-wing conservative pro-government or illiberal side of the political spectrum. They're promoting illiberal agendas and thereby serving as important instruments for the growth of the illiberal public sphere. When it comes to the transition from the ascendant to hegemonic stage of the illiberal public sphere, we argue that this transition is marked by another important change in the communication system, another constitutive process, and that is the shifting role of the online media and particularly social media. Of course, We know that digital channels have played a very important part in the rise of the illiberal public sphere in Eastern Europe during the first half of the previous decade, because it was predominantly populist and also increasingly illiberal actors who were amongst the first or early adopters of these technologies. They used them very successfully as an instrument of mobilization. And they also were among the first ones to apply a very systematic, professionalized approach towards the use of social media channels in political communication, such as the former and possibly future Prime Minister of Czech Republic, Andrej Babiš, who is depicted here with his social media guru, Marek Prchal, following the landslide victory of the party in the 2017 elections, which was to a large extent attributed to the social media strategy. However, having said that, we argue that as the illiberal public sphere progresses and public service media and other mainstream media channels are becoming sort of captured by illiberal actors, social media have become increasingly important as channels for pro-liberal voices and pro-democracy activism, and therefore they start playing a more important role as places of resistance against illiberalism. This is apparent from our analysis of the relationship between social media use for political expression, so liking, commenting, sharing political content on social media, and several different measures of liberal attitudes, which I don't have time to explain now, but I'm happy to do that in questions and answers part if there's interest. So you can see from this table that the relationship is positive in most countries except for Poland. So we can claim that those people who use social media for political expression / activism tend to be more likely to be more liberal minded and more likely to prefer democracy over authoritarianism. There are other findings from our research project that support our argument about social media playing a more positive role in resisting illiberalism rather than serving as its key channel, although that role is obviously also there. We just emphasize the kind of balance of this role, which is changing as the illiberal public sphere progresses. So the support for this argument comes also from our data on the relationship between various types of news media use and beliefs in selected conspiracy theories, including those that have featured George Soros, the famous boogeyman of the far right, especially in Hungary and Serbia, but increasingly in the other countries as well. And our survey data, but also interviews, suggests that when it comes to the effect of different news channels on people's susceptibility to conspiracy narratives, it is actually the mainstream media, and especially again in Hungary and Serbia, that are likely to have a more profound impact on people than digital platforms, especially on those people in those countries who consume public service media, which, as you know, are very much channels of government propaganda. So based on these findings, we argue that the more advanced illiberal public sphere, the higher the proportion of mainstream media that take an active and regular part in spreading disinformation, false information, or disinformation narratives, up to the point of assuming the very central role in the disinformation news ecosystem. Both as amplifiers and producers of propaganda and conspiracy theories. So, in other words, digital platforms are not necessarily the only, and in some cases, even not even the most important part of the local disinformation ecosystems. So, to sum up, find a few words. So, the illiberal public sphere is a concept that, as explained in this talk, allows us to capture the communicative aspects of illiberalism and the role of the media. So something that we believe has been missing so far from the from the theorizing, but also empirical research on illiberalism to a large extent. It allows to account for both systemic and cultural factors in the rise of illiberalism, as Sabina explained already. And the processual model of the illiberal public sphere, the staged model, allows us to adopt a more nuanced, longitudinal perspective on various types of changes in media and political systems. It also moves away from the kind of linear, narrow, and to some extent almost teleological discourse on the process of democratization, which has again dominated the kind of transition studies for years, because it actually this approach allows for or accounts for the possible reversal of the process. So there's no longer the liberal model as the only sort of destination on the horizon. We know that it can go the other way as well. And finally, it provides a conceptual tool to assess and compare relative development of the illiberal public sphere in different countries. So it has this comparative, the advantage of being potentially applied for comparative research, both for the established democracies and those which have been on the downward slope for a while. So this is where I'm gonna end the talk. Obviously, there's I'm sure there's a lot of things that we didn't have time to say in those 30 minutes, but we'll be happy to complement those points that were made in the Q&A session. So looking forward to your questions. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you so much, Sabina and Václav, for this presentation. And it's really, I think, showing the depth and the kind of theoretical contribution that the book is bringing to the discussion. So we now have almost half an hour for the Q&A session, which I think will give us great time to continue the discussion. Let me begin with the first question, and I invite everybody to ask questions in the chat. So don't hesitate. A first question about the role of government and legislation in contributing or fostering the creation of polarized media landscape. Do you see the gap kind of either driven by market forces, or do we have political actors that are the main kind of catalyst? How would you add this kind of government and legislation level in your analysis? I will begin with that and then continue with some other questions. Sabina, I let you decide. Yes.
Do you have any preferences, Václav?
I've spoken for a while now. I will leave the floor to you.
But you can add. I would say in general, both economic and political forces can contribute. The extent to which each of those does so depends on the country and the type of political system, if that makes sense. So in the book, we look both at instances where illiberal political leaders, when they come to power, change governance structures, change policies that allow them greater control over the media, typically first by exerting more control over public service media, but then gradually also other parts of media. And then in parallel, we also show or draw on existing research that shows how the political economy of the media is changing at the same time, and how media owners in the private media sector start aligning themselves ideologically with illiberal political leaders for different reasons. Some of them genuinely share those same assumptions and illiberal values. Others do so because it's commercially expedient, because it brings them more profit. And then gradually, obviously, because they can benefit from aligning themselves with political elites that are in power, this itself then brings further commercial benefits to them. So I would say a bit of both is at work. But obviously, in a country that has a stronger, say, public service media sector, for instance, the role of political elite in driving polarization, at least initially, it's stronger. In countries with a stronger commercial sector, that is more of an involvement of economic actors. And let's bear in mind that owners of media, if we look at the private media sectors, often own not just the media, they own, media are in a way an addition to their other business interests. So that's also perhaps an important consideration there. Yeah.
If I may quickly add to that, I think that the role of the private media owners is absolutely critical in deciding whether the country as such moves further down the road towards the hegemonic phase or not. And we have in our research, we have actually examples of both scenarios, and looking at Poland in particular, we need to acknowledge that it has been the resistance of a substantial part of the private commercial media sector that basically played a key role in preventing from the country to go further down the spiral of illiberalism, and prevented from the illiberal public sphere to further grow, because without the actually foreign-owned strong media brands, probably the previous government would have succeeded in capturing bigger part of the media spectrum, and the illiberal turn would have been probably harder to avoid in a longer time period. So, and in Slovakia, we are observing very much the same struggle, because it's easier for the government to capture public service media, which they already did. But now the main opponent is one of the few remaining opponents is the private media, at least some of them who haven't yet bowed down to the government pressures.
Yeah, thank you so much. And you can see maybe in the chat we have a comment from our colleague Janet saying that comparing with what we have in the US, of course, the US is a huge a state that was that had a lot of local media news that are now kind of largely disappeared, at least in some states that are called kind of media deserts. And usually, indeed, once you lose the local media, people move to national media that are much more polarized ideologically. And so, two kind of follow-up question, right? One about in Central Europe, the diminishing presence on local media, if that makes sense for, of course, kind of smaller countries, so it's not necessarily the same. And also linked to that, also the question of, what is politics, what is market, and how this kind of dramatic changes of, the business model of all media, not only digital media, but including newspaper, private channel TV that do 24/7 kind of news, how this kind of model of, type of Berlusconi style, so you don't know if it's politics or entertainment. How do you think, so that are changes that are not specific to Central Europe, how do you think that also play a role in the kind of cultivating polarization, in fact, as a kind of almost a product of interpreting news as entertainment? So one question on the diminishing presence of local news, increasing focus on national news, and one on this kind of a business model that is combining news and entertainment.
Maybe I can start with local news, Václav. So the local news is not something that we covered, Janet. Hi, by the way, it's nice to see you, so to speak, here. It's not something that we actually covered empirically, I have to acknowledge, in the book. But we have actually been involved in a subsequent project with several journalistic associations from the region that has looked at local media. And it was in particular in recognition that local media could actually act as a kind of bulwark against further polarization. But at that point, we were also observing that local media themselves were becoming polarized. And captured to a degree. So you are very much rather there in an important player. They can prevent polarization, but they can also be further drawn into it themselves, I would say. I think, Marlene, you asked, about size. Certainly size matters in a more kind of, in a larger state like the US and more federalized countries. Certainly regional and local media will play an even greater role, I would say, and their disappearance will potentially contribute. Yeah, but as I said, even in smaller countries, in parts of Europe that we looked at, there is a role for local media in this process as well. Yeah.
Yeah, just to add to that quickly, again, going back to the point I made previously about the difference between the trajectories of Hungary and Poland, that has something to do with local media as well, because it was through the local media that Viktor Orban gained a lot of support and popularity in Hungary. He was able to capture through his oligarchs, of course, pretty much all the networks of local media in Hungary, and those are the media that are consumed primarily by elderly people, rural population, so natural voters for Orban. But the same didn't exactly happen in Poland, where local media have been, or regional media have been still relatively independent, because they were in the hands, so being owned by the German publisher, which is exactly why the Polish government, controlled by Law and Justice Party, the conservative government, tried to oust the German owners out of the market. So yeah, I think this is a sort of micro level or layer of the kind of processes that we describe on a national level, but we can illustrate some of these processes also through the importance of local media. And I fully agree that there might be something to say about the way that the local market has crashed in the US, the local news media market, and therefore people have no other options but to simply rely on the very much partisan media landscape in the US, which is fostering further polarization.
Mm-hmm. And to follow up, in fact, a question from Jay on the asking you to expand on the meaning of the term polarization, and maybe not only the meaning, but the process of polarization, right? It's a little bit the kind of chicken and eggs dilemma. If the hollowing out of the middle that you were showing in your graph, is that a symptom of polarization, or is that the result of the population being polarized? So how do we try to think this kind of causal effect of media and polarization, that I think was one of the core elements you wanted to look at in the book?
Yeah. Obviously, we cannot really tell what is the chicken and egg here. We describe, we have mapped the situation at certain time points. So our study is not a longitudinal one, but through the indirect evidence, we argue that basically this is a spiral, that is a cyclical process that reinforces itself. So in other words, the hollowing out of the middle is both a symptom and the result of the process that has already begun, that has had some kind of starting point earlier in the history of the market. We don't know exactly when, but once the spiral starts spinning, it's very difficult to stop it, and it just becomes more intense, and the center hollows out gradually more and more. So yeah, we describe polarization both in terms of comparing different editorial stances of news media outlets on the different sides of the political spectrum, ideological spectrum, but also as a process of further expanding of these gaps between the news outlets and the news audience's habits. Although we have to acknowledge, and that's one of the limitations of our research, we don't have the longitudinal data to support the latter, to support that claim about the longitudinal effects.
Wonderful. One more question that, in fact, I think is a really an important one from Erica. So you outline incipient, ascendant, and hegemonic stages. So do we have evidence that media ecosystem can desescalate back toward more pluralistic norms? What would be the tipping point of that? And maybe if you could comment on the example of Poland after 2023 being one of the only countries that moved away from an illiberal government. Does that have any impact on the media landscape? So is there a kind of post-illiberalism moment that can happen? We don't have a lot of examples. Poland is probably one of the key ones.
So very quick, Sabina, we want to comment as well, but very quickly, just to explain the fact that Poland has avoided what's sometimes what we call the full illiberal turn by means of electing a pro-liberal democratic government a couple of years ago doesn't mean that something substantial has changed in the character of the illiberal versus liberal public spheres. Yeah, we would still probably classify Poland as sitting right in the ascendant stage because it is certainly possible that in the following elections, the tables will turn again, and Poland will end up with an illiberal government. We remain to see, but the political and media systems remain quite significantly polarized. So we cannot simply assume that because of the one election, something substantially changed in the underlying character of the public spheres.
Yeah,
Sabina? Yeah.
I can add. Yeah, I think what's key here is what then happens, if there is a change of government in the other direction. What and to what extent is actually this government able to do? Can they reverse legislation? Do they actually, and do even these reversals of legislation then actually translate into practice? So to what extent is, TVP, for instance, as the central public service media in Poland, been able to act differently since then? And by this, I mean, not just reversing to a fully liberal version, but actually genuinely fostering, an exchange of opinions. Yeah. So it's not sufficient only to roll over and change, for instance, journalists and editors. So there's a change in norms and practices of journalism that is required. But back maybe to the question of tipping points as well, just briefly. So we identify and focus in particular on one in the book, which is the capture of the public service media system as a very important tipping point, after which it becomes much more difficult to reverse the course of affairs. We're not saying that it's not possible, but it's become more difficult. And I would say the second tipping point that we don't really theorize in the book, but we have been talking about it since then, is the capture of digital media platforms. So that would probably be another, but we can return back to that later. I see there's some other questions in the meantime in the chat.
Yeah, two other questions, in fact, connected to each other. One on the transnational aspect or the sharing of strategy, right? One of your chapters, the one on Poland, is called Following on Orban's Footsteps. So do you see this kind of transition? I mean, do you see kind of connection between what is happening in a country and another one? Is there a learning process happening? And linked to that, on your last slide, you were mentioning this kind of, moving away from what has been for very long, the kind of transitology narrative of Central Europe, and showing the kind of reversal aspect. And so one of the questions is that when you study Central Europe, does it still make sense is there still something that you would identify as specific to Central Europe when we see what is happening in Western Europe, in the US, right? Is there still something that looks like a Central European specificity, or what you bring in the book is in fact really kind of whatever the regional case studies would be applicable for Western European and American context?
Take the first one, Václav, and you do the second, or
remind me what the first one was.
The first one is on the kind of strategy sharing. Do you see these transition countries related, or is there kind of learning from one or from each other?
I think we have been given answer to that question by the very illiberal actors who are trying to get some inspiration from, especially Viktor Orban and what has been going on in Hungary. So Donald Trump is openly embracing the strategies that Orban applied in Hungary. The difference being that, and that's sort of a catchphrase that has been used quite often. What has happened in Hungary over the period of a decade, Trump is attempting to do in the US within months. So that's different. But yeah, definitely there are other examples of learning attempts by other illiberal actors and leaders. The Czech Prime Minister Andrej Babiš is currently very much openly championing the idea of changing the system of public service broadcasting in the Czech Republic, following the Hungarian model. So he wants to merge the two broadcasting institutions, and also to switch from license fee funding to direct state funding, which is very much, again, applying the Viktor Orban's playbook. So yeah, these illiberal leaders and actors have been definitely inspiring each other, and maybe that also ties in with the other question, and Sabina will probably say more about it. But the very fact that there are these models being applied in other countries outside or beyond Central and Eastern Europe means that there's probably not as much specific to, or particular to the cases of Central and Eastern Europe than it used to be, and our model definitely aspires to be applicable to countries beyond Central and Eastern Europe. But maybe Sabina wants to expand on that.
Yeah, so just to briefly also say on the aspect of transnationalism, we do elaborate on that as well in the book on the transnational components of learning within the region. But obviously, what Václav refers to is also beyond the region. There's quite a bit of learning as we see, either intentional learning, so really copying strategy, or more unintentional. There's also obviously evidence of exchanges at the level of political elites, ideological exchanges, but in the media sector, there's exchanges in terms of regulatory strategies, for instance, or learning in that sense. I would say, so yes, the model is, we would say, to a large extent globally applicable, but how exactly certain elements play out will differ depending on the political system. So I think the fact that certain processes can happen so quickly in the US may be two factors. First, there's been countries that have done this, so there's a model to follow. But B, potentially also it's a different political system where obviously the president holds much more power within the political system. So that's an important factor to play. Another element to consider is the position of different types of media. So obviously public service media sector is much smaller in the US, and it's oriented toward foreign publics. So the changes that are happening there in relation to Voice of America will not so much have an impact domestically, although there is some impact domestically as well, but largely internationally, and on the extent and the ways in which the US can influence foreign opinion. So there's some diversity, and there's certainly scope to think about how the processes we identified then play out slightly differently depending on different political and media systems, and that's certainly something we would like to work on, in the future.
Yeah, that sounds fascinating. Maybe two last questions that are kind of very contemporary or policy oriented. One on, well, which solution do we have? Is there anything else that can be imagined as if you are a scholar talking to policy people, what would be a series of advice you may have? Is that all relying on public media services as the only place where we can avoid polarization, or is there a way to kind of think or imagine a private media sector that wouldn't be polarized in the context we have now? And a second question on the role of kind of geopolitical issue overlapping with this polarization and illiberal media sphere, with the case of Romania and the election being cancelled in the name of interference from Russia. So how, as media communication scholar, how do you see this kind of connection between democracy, media, and foreign interference, and how much is that kind of something where the knowledge you have been building can help us kind of better understanding the legitimacy of the claims and the issue the claims may also have? So two heavy questions. to finish on.
I can start, and Václav, we can continue. So, but public service media certainly are an important player in trying to counter what's been happening. Another actor might be local media, as we said before, in countries where they are still, reasonably thriving or can be supported. And obviously local media quite often are commercial media, although not often. So I do feel there is a role for the commercial sector to play in this as well, especially when addressing local and regional issues, which tend to play differently. I think with regards to your second question about geopolitics, I can see how the geopolitical situation, and especially concerns over Russian interference, could, on the one hand, and be used to help kind of reverse or slow down the illiberal turn. But the way this is happening, and we see this in Romania, is happening in a way that could also be damaging to democracy, because obviously the extent to which certain views have taken ground among people, then simply closing them off by saying they are Russian and they are a result of foreign interference is clearly problematic for a democratic country. And obviously this is an active debate in Romania still that is ongoing. So it's almost like countering the illiberal turn through illiberal means, if that makes sense. Yeah, so that's the danger.
Václav, and you will have the last word.
I just wanted to briefly show another publication which came out of our project, and that's exactly the policy-oriented report, which is aimed at various stakeholders, media regulators, and journalists themselves. And one aspect of that is also oriented or focusing on how to avoid increasing polarization. And there are different ways how to do that, or at least on the paper. It's of course much more difficult to do it on the ground, but we do recommend certain steps, certain measures for the regulatory authorities to enforce impartiality, which they have actually means to do, both for the public service media but also for the commercial media. We have some recommendations for the journalistic practices, how to avoid fueling the polarizing narratives, polarizing language. These are all things that can be somehow managed, and quite often, unfortunately, media choose not to do that because, as someone pointed in the chat also, it's simply commercially more lucrative to to keep fanning the flames and benefit from those tendencies, rather than being responsible and upholding the traditional sort of professional journalistic values of impartiality, accuracy, fairness, and so on. So there is some recommendations that we have formulated, and we welcome people to take a closer look at them in the publication, which is accessible on our website.
Well, wonderful. I think on that, it's good to finish, because we are all discussing this kind of depressing topic. So it's good to finish on something that looks like, more not only analyzing the difficulties, but also trying to think about solution and kind of way of circumvent that global trend. So it's a nice way to finish our discussion. And yeah, Václav just posted the link so you can download this report that has more kind of policy advice aspect. And so Sabina, Václav, wanted to thank you once again and congratulate you with the publication of that book, because that's really a great contribution to the field globally. It's good to see communication and media people participating in that illiberalism discussion, and it's really super highlighting and bringing so many good nuances that we need now in this current situation by looking at this example from Central Europe. But as we said, there's so much to learn from your book that are applicable for the rest of Europe and the transatlantic world. So thank you once again, and we hope to see everybody soon for one of our other events. Thanks again, Sabina and Václav.
Thank you, Marlene,
Thank
and
you
the
all.
organizers and all the audience for their presence and for listening to our talk and for the
Thank
good
you.
questions.
Bye-bye. Yes, bye.